And that's it.
Thank you, Bruce, for giving us a moment to sit in silence and really think about whose land we are on and help us get centered as we begin our workshop. So I'm going to take you to the next slide and talk a little bit about our agenda for the day. So we're going to cover a few different things. So just like our last education and action workshop, there'll be the education portion, and there'll be a little bit of time for journaling. And then there will also be time at the end, if you choose to stay past 5 o'clock, to get into breakout rooms, to do some brainstorming together, to figure out the ways you can take actions in your community, in your congregation, individually as well. And so there'll be some options for that for folks who choose to stay from 5 to 5:30. And with that, I'm going to have you all take a quick poll just to kind of get a sense of who's in this space and what our knowledge is that we already know before I turn it over to Pat. So just the 2 quick questions should pop up in front of you. Go ahead and click the option that fits you. So it looks like prior to the workshop, most people have heard of the Doctrine of Discovery and some people haven't, which is great. We have a good combination of folks. And there should be, I'm going to ask Bruce on this is the first time I've done the poll. So with the next question, are people able to see that one?
We'll end the poll.
Oh, they're 2 separate ones. Sorry.
Yep.
I got it. Thank you.
Go. Here, we'll share the results. All right, you can do the second one now.
So I share the results and then, okay. It's still showing the first one.
Stop sharing.
Okay, now there's the next question. Great, so the next part is prior to the workshop, everyone's heard of Manifest Destiny, and I would have to say that I am also in that group of folks that I am more familiar with the concept of Manifest Destiny than I have heard of the Doctrine of Discovery before. So good to know. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Pat.
Okay, well, first a disclaimer, I'm not an expert in these subjects. I became interested in our local Indigenous people after hearing Bruce say that land acknowledgement every Sunday. And I realized that I knew almost nothing about the people whose land we were occupying. And I also wondered whether there were ways that we could address past and current injustices. So I started doing a little Wikipedia research, and it grew from there as I became fascinated by the Ohlone people and their history. At the same time, our climate group, Cool Planet, began emphasizing environmental justice. And here are some words from our PCUSA website that explain how this all fits together. As people of faith, we have a moral call to pursue environmental justice, the sustainable and equitable sharing of the gifts of God's creation among all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, or class. Yes, inequities abound. To take steps towards healing our relationship with God's creation and each other, we need to understand the roots of the injustice. A root cause of environmental injustice is the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery originated with the Christian church and was based on Christian scripture. For more than 5 centuries, the doctrine of discovery and the laws based upon it have legalized the theft of land, labor, and resources from Indigenous peoples and systematically denied their human rights. Outside of Indigenous people and scholars, however, few are aware of the continued impacts of the doctrine of the discovery. In the US today, Indigenous peoples continue to experience systemic injustices through broken treaties, land and resource theft, inadequate protection of sacred sites, and pollution of their air and water. As Christians, now is the time to understand our role in the injustice and seek to rectify it. We go on to the next slide. I'm still seeing the poll. I don't know if others are.
No, it's gone. You can
It's
clear
gone,
from yours.
okay.
Yep.
Good. So first, what is the doctrine of discovery? So 2/3 of us have at least heard of it. And we hope to just join the few who are aware of the continued impacts of it. The first step in learning what it is and how it started and how it has affected property ownership law in the United States. We're going to play most of a TED Talk by one of the authors of the book, Unsettling Truths, who explained this much better than I could. And if you want to know more, you can read his book.
Let me demonstrate. Invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and to their use and profit. These are the words of Pope Nicholas V in a papal bull written in 1452. Now, this papal bull, along with other papal bulls written between 1452 and 1493, collectively are known as what we call the Doctrine of Discovery. The Doctrine of Discovery is essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever land you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their lands are yours for the taking. This is literally the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people. They didn't believe them to be human. This is the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was lost at sea, land in this new world, which was already inhabited by millions, and claimed to have discovered it. If you think about it, you cannot discover lands already inhabited. If you don't believe me, leave your cell phones, your smartphones, your car keys, your laptops out. I'll come by and discover them for you. Clearly, this is not discovery, right? This is stealing, this is conquering, this is colonizing. The fact that to this day we have a national holiday honoring Christopher Columbus as the discoverer of America reveals the implicit racial bias of the nation, which is that indigenous peoples, people of color, are not fully human. So this makes the doctrine of discovery a systemically white supremacist doctrine that assumes the dehumanization of indigenous peoples. Now, the challenge is what our founding fathers have done with this doctrine throughout our nation's history. So in 1763, King George drew a line down the Appalachian Mountains, and he said to the colonies that were here that they no longer had the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upset the colonies. They wanted access to those lands. So a few years later, they wrote a letter of protest. In their letter, they accused the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. They went on in their letter to state that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages. They signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. Literally 30 lines below the statement, all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages. making it very clear the only reason our founding fathers used this inclusive term all men is because they had a very narrow definition of who was actually human. This, of course, makes our Declaration of Independence a systemically white supremacist document that assumes the dehumanization of indigenous peoples. Now, a few years later, our founding fathers wrote another document. They started this one with the words, "We the people of the United States." This, of course, is the preamble to the Constitution. However, if you read just a few lines later, down to Article 1, Section 2, Article 1, Section 2 is the section of the Constitution that defines who is and who is not covered by this Constitution, who is and who is not a part of this union. If you read Article 1, Section 2, the first thing you will note is it never mentions women. This is important because if you read the entire Constitution from preamble through the 27th Amendment, you will find that there are 51 gender-specific male pronouns in regards to who can run for office, who can hold office, even who is protected by this document. 51 he, him, and his, and not a single female pronoun. So we first have to note, Article 1, Section 2 never mentions women. Second, it specifically excludes natives. And third, it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So who's left? Well, white landowning men is who could vote. Now, we have to ponder this for a moment. The reason our Constitution was written, the purpose of our Constitution, is to protect the interests of white landowning men. So today, we act shocked that women earn 70 cents to the dollar. This shouldn't shock us. Our Constitution is working. We act surprised that our prisons are filled with people of color. This shouldn't surprise us. Our Constitution is working. We act outraged that in 2010, the Supreme Court sided with Citizens United and rules that corporations now have the same rights to political free speech as individuals. This is what opens the door for super PACs, unlimited contributions to candidates. This shouldn't surprise us. The Constitution's doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's protecting the interests of white landowning men. So this makes our Constitution a systemically white supremacist and sexist document that assumes the white landowning male has the authority to decide who is and who is not human. Now, about 50 years later, we had a Supreme Court case. This is Johnson versus McIntosh. It's two men of European descent. They're litigating over a single piece of land. One of them got the land from a native tribe, the other one got the same piece of land from the government, and they wanted to know who owned it, who had the right to sell the land. The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. This is the Marshall Court, and they had to decide the principle upon which land titles were based. So they ruled that the principle was that discovery gave title to the land. And then they go on to reference the Doctrine of Discovery and rule that natives who were here first but are less than human, we only have what's called the right of occupancy to the land, like a fish would occupy water or a bird would occupy the air. And Europeans have the right of discovery to the land, the fee title to the land, and therefore they are the true title holders. This, of course, creates the legal precedent for land titles. This and a few other cases between the 1820s and 1830s. And this precedent and the Doctrine of Discovery are referenced by the Supreme Court in 1954, in 1985, and most recently in 2005. Now, I want to talk about this 2005 case for a moment. So in 1998, the Oneida Indian Nation purchased some of their traditional lands on the open market. They paid full price for them in the state of New York, which is where they traditionally resided, and they wanted to exercise their traditional sovereignty over these lands, which would mean they were not taxable. Now, the city of Sherrill, which is where the lands resided, they wanted the tax revenue from these lands, and so they sued the Oneida Indian Nation in federal district court. The Oneida Indian Nation won that case, and the city of Sherrill appealed to the Federal Court of Appeals. The decision was upheld, and so they appealed to the Supreme Court. The case was heard in 2005, and in arguing this case, the court actually reversed the rulings of the lower courts, and in the first footnote of the case, when they're setting precedent, they reference the Doctrine of Discovery. They then go on to argue that given the Oneida's long delay in seeking judicial relief, we hold that the tribe cannot unilaterally revive its ancient sovereignty. They then go on to argue that it is impossible to rescind the cession and restore the Indians to their former rights because the lands have been open to settlement, which is white settlement, and large portions of them are now in the possession of innumerable innocent purchasers. Now, in the original 1823 Supreme Court cases, John Marshall is building his case. He actually refers to natives as savages. And he says, but the tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages, whose occupation was war, and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forests. To leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness. Now, in 2005, the court makes almost the same argument. It says, moreover, the properties here involved have greatly increased in value since the Oneidas sold them 200 years ago. Notably, it was not until lately that the Oneidas sought to regain ancient sovereignty over land converted from wilderness to become parts of city like Sherrill. This is the same argument John Marshall was making. It's just not using the word savages. So the Supreme Court then concludes that we now reject the unification theory of the Oneida Indian Nation and the United States, and hold that the standards of federal Indian law, which again, in footnote 1, is based on the Doctrine of Discovery, and the federal equity practice preclude the tribe from rekindling the embers of sovereignty that long ago grew cold. This is quite possibly the most white supremacist Supreme Court decision written in my lifetime. And it was written and delivered by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. See,
let's stop it here and we'll move on.
Is a bipartisan value.
So, sorry to shock you about RBG. But let's move on to Manifest Destiny, which all of us have heard about. And it grew out of the Doctrine of Discovery. And it was also based on several biblical texts, mainly the narrative of a covenant people justified in taking possession of land and native people, as described in the Exodus story. And in Genesis 17, which is in today's lectionary, we discussed it at early church, where God said to Abram, he will give you all the land and for a perpetual holding, and I will be their God. And also just the Great Commission, as it's called in Matthew 28, go therefore and make disciples of all nations. We're going to show another short video that explains a little more about Manifest Destiny.
And this is Meredith. I'll just add that you will have an opportunity to do some journaling and kind of like individual processing, since we're covering a lot here before we get into the next part of today's workshop. So just sit tight for another few minutes and we'll get there.
In my work, we use this picture, a picture about manifest destiny. There's this woman that the painter names Columba walking through and across the prairie. There is light that comes behind her. She is actually bringing the light from east to west. And she's carrying a book of wisdom. She's carrying the lines of the telegraph. And there are all these settlers coming alongside of her and behind her. And in front of her, shadows and dark skies, there's sort of darkness. And there's all these indigenous people running away. It's a painting designed to help illustrate how Manifest Destiny operated. The power of the image, that notion that we are the people of the light, that we are the people who bring civilization, wisdom, the theological implications of Manifest Destiny, that white people were entitled to this land. Not only are they entitled to possess it, they are entitled to eliminate anything that stands in the way of progress. And race is a big part of that ideology. It's this belief that we have been granted as a nation a special place, and that within that nation, white people have been granted a special place. The ways that all of that is still held in our imagery, in our mythology, this idea that the United States brings civilization or democracy to other countries in the order of the society.
So this is Meredith again. So we're going to give you about 3 minutes, and you're welcome to type up on your computer or take a note on a piece of paper, thinking about this question and the information that you just received from both videos. So the Doctrine of Discovery and Manifest Destiny is the old American identity. What would a new American identity that truly blesses all people look like? So take about 3 minutes to journal that. And then after, instead of having a large group share out, we'll ask you to put some of your thoughts, brief thoughts in the chat before we move on. So I'll give you 3 minutes. Okay, so take another 30 seconds or so to finish the thought that you're on as you're reflecting. And then take a moment and put a few of your thoughts in the chat, and I will call them out to the rest of the group. This will be our way to share back with each other so that we still have time to move on to talking about some of the local Indigenous groups that are in our area. So again, the question was, what would a new American identity that truly blesses all people look like? Deborah's pointing out that it's overwhelming and it's hard to begin to imagine. Mary Jo says a vision of wilderness covering the earth, creatures, including all beings, descending gently onto the earth, treating the earth as a gift to share and care for. Colette says that it provides public education throughout life and that that's what blesses all people. Katie's pointing out that one acknowledges humanity and the image of God in all people. Allison's pointing out reciprocity in a land and reparations for all people. Martha is pointing out correcting injustices and acknowledging the past error of our ways. Shirley is pointing out that a new identity would recognize the racism implicit and explicit in the Constitution and the full rights and humanity of all people. Thank you so much for sharing your imaginations with us. It's very challenging, I think, especially because our myths and our, American identity is so deeply entrenched in the video, like as Jessica Vasquez Torres shared. A couple more. Barry's saying a new American identity would address all aspects of inequality that inhibit self-determination by all people with respect to Indigenous people. One step would be a return of large amounts of federally owned land to American Indian tribes. Ellen points out the repudiation of white supremacy and acknowledgement of systemic racism. Jeff pointing out the settlers spread west, they killed bison and even the carrier pigeon. I wonder how threats of extinction are the result of our settler colonial mindset. Repentance means stopping the harm to the environment and God's creatures. And with that, Pat, I'll turn it over to you.
So we want to try to make this a little more concrete by focusing on how the Ohlone people have experienced and continue to experience systemic environmental injustice through three things I read earlier: land and resource theft, inadequate protection of sacred sites, pollution of air and water. So keep these in mind as we go through these case studies. But first, I want to start with a brief review of the Ohlone history, which is different from many tribes in other parts of our country because of the Spanish and Mexican influence. Those of you who were here last time or heard me speak in October have heard some of this, but it'll be a nice review. As best as people can figure out, historians think that people have lived around San Francisco Bay for about 6,000 years. And when Portola discovered the San Francisco Bay, he was lost trying to find Monterey Bay. The Ohlone comprised 50 landholding groups and had a population estimated at 17,000. They didn't consider themselves a single tribe and in fact spoke 6 different languages with many dialects. And then after Portola came the 50 years of the Spanish mission period, where Ohlone people were forced to work and live at 7 missions that were built in this area. And for various reasons, there was a great decrease in population. down to 1700, which means they were literally decimated. That was followed by a Mexican period, and it was actually these Mexican land grants that really meant that the Ohlonies were not going to get their land back. There had been some understanding maybe with the missions that they might, but many Ohlone people just went to work as laborers on these ranchos, and their population was further reduced to under 1,000. Then in California came the settlers coming from the east, drawn by the gold rush. And it was a lawless time. Our first governor was an open advocate of exterminating indigenous people, and people throughout the state were killed. And by 1900, the Ohlone were almost extinct. For instance, of all the Ramaitish people, which are the San Francisco Peninsula, are descendants of one woman. In modern day, the groups have formed, 3 groups have formed that were based on which mission their ancestors had come through. The Muwekma Ohlone tribes were at missions Dolores in San Francisco, San Jose, and Santa Clara. The Amamutsan tribal band was Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista, and the Esalen Nation, Carmel and Soledad. None of these groups are federally recognized, so that means they don't own much land except for any small land trusts that they have started. And currently about 1,400 people claim Ohlone ancestry. So last month's presentation was about the Amamutsan and their policies of trying to promote indigenous practices for land burning for management of fires. And this time we're going to talk about a program that a campaign they have to protect Eurostock. And again, we're going to play a little video by their chairman.
Our creation story tells us Creator specifically picked our people to care for the lands of our territory, which Creator defined for us. What was most important is that we maintain the land as sacred. Eurostock is the most sacred site of our tribal territory. My name is Valentin Lopez, and I'm the chairman of the Amamutsan tribal band. And our tribe is comprised of the descendants of the indigenous peoples that were taken to mission San Juan Bautista and Santa Cruz. You know, and once they bought Eurostock, they announced shortly thereafter that they applied for a sand and gravel mining permit right at Eurostock where the ceremonies were held. It was a place where we held our most important and our highest ceremonies. They are also trying to make the claim that this here would be good for the environment because they could put 95% of that ranch into conservation and do mining on the 5%. That 95% of the conservation values would offset any damage done by the mine. However, that totally ignores the spiritual values. You know, I mean, if you put no regard to spiritual values, then that may be a true claim. But Native American spirituality has never been respected or protected or valued. As part of the AB 52 process, we requested an ethnographic study to be completed. And that ethnographic study is to document the evidence, both the written records and the tribal oral history of Eurostock. our history and our culture was never understood. But there's so much value and so much importance to our traditional ways of taking care of the environment that they should be working with us to help us restore that knowledge so that we can know how to take care of Mother Earth going forward into the future.
Just so you
Our
understand
creation story tells us, Creator specifically.
a little more about this project. Uristock or Sargent Ranch is along 101, just the border of Santa Clara and San Benito counties. Besides its spiritual significance, it's ecologically important as a wildlife linkage route between the Santa Cruz and Gabilan ranges and is home to several endangered species. It contains a sensitive watershed whose aquifer might be disturbed by excavation and operation of the quarry, which would also increase traffic and air pollution along Highway 101. Groups like the Center for Biological Diversity have been working with local land trusts to buy Sargent Ranch, but so far the owner has refused to sell. Currently, a draft environmental impact report, EIR, is being prepared for Santa Clara County Planning Commission and is expected to be released in late 2021. After it's released, there will be a public comment period, typically 60 days. The county must review and respond to all public comments before publishing the final EIR. The Planning Commission reviews that and makes a decision to approve or deny the conditional use permit. And then this decision can be appealed to the County Board of Supervisors. So we will send you some links after this program. Some of the things you can do about this are just follow the campaign on the Amamutsun Facebook page or their website, and you can sign a petition at the protecturistock.org website. And if you're a Santa Clara County resident, you can get on the mailing list so that you can make public comments, which they have to respond to, and we'll put that link out later. I really like this quote from a former Santa Clara County supervisor who was on one of these walks for Uristock. You will hear political arguments that with all the construction and the development that is taking place in South County, we need that sand and we need that gravel. What we need is clean air. What we need is unpolluted rivers. What we need is respect for culture and the dignity of Indigenous people. Together, we will achieve a victory for Mother Earth and for all of us by making sure that the county does not approve this project. And a second example is, this is these are in the Muwekma Ohlone, and this is actually in Oakland. It involves an urban Indigenous women-led trust. And much of my information comes from a recent San Francisco Chronicle article, which we'll send a link to. The Sagareate Land Trust facilitates the return of indigenous land to Indigenous people. They use the term rematriate, meaning to restore a people to their rightful place in sacred relationship with their ancestral land. They currently have 3 small parcels of land that have been donated to them. They use the land as a public space for cultural revitalization and education, and as a place to teach Chochenyo people traditional ways of caring for the land. They feel that the taking of land was a deep soul wound, and the land trust will help the Ohlone find their way back to being an active, thriving part of the cultural landscape of the East Bay. They get funding through the Shumi Land Tax, which is a voluntary annual contribution paid by non-Indigenous people living or owning businesses on their traditional territory. There's a calculator on their website that you might want to take a look at. And other people, for instance, the Ramaitush people on the peninsula, are working on a similar project, and we'll send the links to that as well. Our third example is the Berkeley Chelmond project. And I'll let this film introduce it and then say a little more.
The city of Berkeley started on the shores of what we now call the San Francisco Bay. Before the university, before California cuisine, before landfills and parking lots, my people settled here in Huichin. More than 5,000 years ago, my Ohlone ancestors built the first fishing village on the bay. At the heart of it was a freshwater creek and 2 massive shell mounds. Archaeologists officially recorded a boundary for the site in 2003, making it eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. After the gold rush, the Spanger family built a restaurant, and Strawberry Creek flowed right through their grotto. The shell mounds were scraped away to fertilize farm fields and pave city streets. In 1907, the site was studied and mapped by archaeologist Nels Nelson. It was landmarked by the city of Berkeley in 2000. Today, the heart of our ancient village is threatened by a 5-story retail and condo project. But we have a different vision for the best use of this land: a green space and a cultural park. In this one area left unbuilt, a 2.2-acre parking lot known as 1900 4th Street, my people still go to remember our ancestors with prayer and ceremony. This is where people lived and died, laughed and cried, and buried our ancestors in the shell mounds. Ohlone people are still here, and we have a vision for this sacred site, not for the commercial development being proposed, but a green space with flowing water, a memorial park where we can rebury our ancestors who were taken away to museums, a place for reflection and ceremony for all. On the top, my people could see fires built on shell mounds across the bay. This is where we sang the Old One spirits out through the Western Gate. This is the birthplace of Berkeley.
Let's go to the next slide. I like this cartoon so much that I just had to show it. The Shell Mound area is indeed the Spenger's parking lot. And it was very interesting to figure out that the Ohlone have been living in the Bay Area since before the time of the pyramids. In a late breaking development, last September, the National Trust for Historic Preservation placed the West Berkeley Shell Mound on the village site on its list of America's 11 most endangered historic places, saying that halting the further desecration of the shell mound and acknowledging this site as a sacred resource of the Ohlone people demonstrates that preservation can be a powerful force for reconciliation and justice. You can follow the progress of this project or donate to it at their website, shellmound.org. So our hope today is that you will, at least one of these projects will have piqued your interest and you'll continue following it and maybe become more attuned to other local Indigenous issues and think about their root causes. And now Jeff Browning is going to tell us how our denomination has been dealing with the Doctrine of Discovery and lead us into some further possibilities for action.
Hi there. Hope you can see me okay. Greetings from the Nisqually land in Olympia, Washington. I thought I'd give you a little rundown on what our Presbyterian Church USA has done. As the slide shows, in 2016, an overture passed calling for the church to confess its complicity and repudiate the Doctrine of Discovery. And that was followed in 2018 by a, well, in 2017, they traveled to Barrow, Alaska, and offered an apology to Native leaders. There was also a meeting at Standing Rock in which they, an interfaith group of religious leaders repudiated the Doctrine of Discovery. And then in 2018, a report was issued, and we'll put some of those links in the chat for you that are very interesting and worth reading. I guess in that, in the most recently in this 2020 General Assembly, the Assembly passed a resolution funding the Native American Coordinating Council, which is part of the Presbyterian Church, for another 4 years, asking the church to help in the development of educational resources and programming, and designated the decade 2020 to 2030, the decade of confession and repentance, when the church will confess and turn around and go in the other direction. Some of the action items that they direct the Presbyterian Mission Agency to conduct is support recognition of sovereignty of nations for many of the tribes that still lack that, encouraging the return of indigenous lands where that is possible, continue to support the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights, as well as to support research into the ongoing trauma that is spans multiple generations for Indigenous peoples, including adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs, that has become widely used. And then also this year, our stated clerk, J. Herbert Nelson, gave further actions in which he really called upon the church to really face up to the history of racism. And it's a very powerful message. And he says, I urge every person, congregation, Presbyterian, synod in this church to read the report and recommend Native American study it and all the resources offered. Not merely theoretical.
Pat, this is Meredith. Could you repeat some of that because your microphone was covered?
My microphone?
Yeah, I think so. Can you just repeat that last part about what every person is urged to do by the stated clerk?
Right. So this is J. Herbert Nelson, the stated clerk of our denomination, saying, I urge every person, congregation, presbytery, and synod in the church to read the report and recommendations of the Native American Coordinating Council, to study it and review all the resources it offers, and to begin a process of unflinching confession and material repentance that is not merely theoretical or internal, but has real, tangible expression that truly contributes to the thriving of Indigenous nations and communities. So toward that end, I've also used the declaration that the church came up with in 2016 to have a declaration that we could adopt in our individual churches and presbytery. And if you care to stay with us following our workshop here, we'll go on and discuss that further, but I want to hand it back over to Meredith.
Thank you, Jeff. And we'll make sure that there will be an email that will go out to everyone that registered with Eventbrite. My apologies for the, some people had some link issues with getting into the meeting, and we are also recording this workshop so that it will be made available if you missed part of it or want to revisit it. It'll be on the San Jose Presbytery website in the next week or so. So that concludes our teaching portion of the workshop. We wanted to give folks an opportunity to, if they would like to stay and join one of these 3 breakout rooms to talk more with us as facilitators about what they might like to do or to process anything from the workshop. We are willing to stay on till 5:30 for folks who would like to do that in the breakout groups and talk more about actions that they would like to take. You are also welcome, if this is the limit of your Zoom meeting, to sign off. And again, the links will also be made available when I send out the follow-up email in a couple days to all the registrants. And then also, if you need ASL interpretation and would like to stay for a breakout room, please make a note of that in the chat to Stephanie, or raise your hand. That would be okay as well. So I will give folks a few minutes to make their decisions if they would like to sign off, and then we can figure out our breakout rooms. And I will stop sharing, and Bruce can probably help us with some of the breakouts for folks who would like to stay.
Yeah,
I'm hoping.
So breakouts are there, and I'm going to open up in a minute, and there are 3, and you can just choose which one you want to go to. So there's confessions. It'll say confessions, Jeff, local Meredith, and individual Pat. And you should be able to just go ahead and choose which one you want to go into. So I'm going to go ahead and open them up. Wait, let me make sure I got my things here. How long do you want them to last, Meredith?
They can last 20 minutes.
All right,
and if you are done sooner, you just come back to the main room. And we probably don't need to record the breakout part in the main room. So
I'm going to make them 25 minutes. So at 6:30, they're going to close. So just know that there's your time limit. And I'm going to go ahead and open those up. Let's see if this works.
Bruce is on Arizona time. It's really 5:30.
Oh,
now.
sorry. Yes, right. Sorry, I am on Arizona time. All right. You should be able to, can you all see, I haven't done it this way before, but can you see if you go to breakouts, or if you want to choose a breakout room? Does anybody? Okay, go ahead and then choose away and go on in. Look at that technology working a little bit. Jeff, you have to, there you go. So Pat, yeah, you have to choose your room, Pat. Martha, if you want to tell me which one you want to go into, I can just put you in one.
I don't really know what that means, but difference between local and individual. I was trying to get into local, but I don't know what does it mean?
I think it was local actions, local issues.
Okay, what does individual mean?
Individual actions with Pat.
Okay, I'll take individual then.
All right, I'll get you in there.
How do I get into it?
Oh, I'll put you in.
Okay, thank you.
Stephanie, I didn't see anybody that requested you. Now, can you tell me a little bit? Are you, how are you connected? How did they contact you? What do you?
So I am, I work with Stone Church. I'm their interpreter coordinator.
Oh, okay.
We have a deaf ministry at Stone Church. We have deaf members. And so I primarily work for them. And I think it was through Sammy Evans, who is, involved in this sort of work otherwise. I'm not exactly sure how it came up, but I was connected with Meredith and was asked to provide. Now, I don't know if there was a request initially